The story begins with an elderly woman named Mrs. Marie, who had lost her husband and son to the war. All she had left was her daughter-in-law and her 7-year-old granddaughter. She wanted to give them a better life, but Kyoto, Japan, was not a good place to raise a child at that time. So, they left the city and moved to a quiet village in the countryside. It was peaceful, maybe too peaceful. Life in the village was not easy. Her daughter-in-law struggled to find work and eventually had to return to the city to earn money. She promised to visit whenever she could, but most of the time, Mrs. Marie was left alone in a place that didn't feel like home. The villagers were kind, but loneliness still weighed on her. Every evening, she took long walks, hoping to ease her sadness. She often saw wild animals in the distance. Since she had lived in the city all her life, she wasn't comfortable around them. She always kept her distance, until one evening changed everything. That day, after her afternoon nap, she stepped outside for her usual walk. She had heard people talk about snakes in the summer, but had never seen one up close. An hour into her walk, she turned a corner and froze. Right in front of her, a long snake lay coiled in the middle of the path. Her breath caught, and fear held her in place. But the snake wasn't looking at her. It had its eyes on something else. Curious, she followed its gaze and saw a tiny baby rat shivering at the base of a tree. The little creature didn't move, too scared to even breathe. For a moment, Mrs. Marie just stood there, watching. Then, something inside her changed. She couldn't let the snake take him. Without thinking, she rushed forward, waving her arms and stomping her feet. She even threw her hat at the snake. Startled, the reptile hesitated before slithering away into the grass. Mrs. Marie let out a breath of relief, but the baby rat was still frozen in fear. Slowly, she knelt down and scooped him up with gentle hands, placing him inside her hat. Holding him close, she hurried home. Inside, she wiped his tiny body with warm water, checking for injuries. He was unharmed, just terrified. She dipped her finger into some sugar water and held it near his mouth. At first, he didn't react, but then he started to drink. Bit by bit, he moved, his tiny nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Encouraged, Mrs. Marie chopped some vegetables and placed them before him. The little rat nibbled away, safe at last. For the first time in years, Mrs. Marie didn't feel alone. She had never cared much for animals, but this tiny rat had changed something in her. He wasn't just another creature. He was smart, affectionate, and full of life. In just a few days, they became inseparable. He scurried around her small house, curled up in her lap, and even perched on her shoulder during her evening walks. But not everyone saw him the way she did. The neighbors weren't happy. To them, he was nothing more than vermin. They urged her to get rid of him, but she refused. Their disapproval only made her feel more distant from the village. Then, word reached her daughter-in-law, who was horrified. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You've lost your mind," she snapped. "If you don't get rid of that rat, I won't let my daughter visit you this summer." Mrs. Marie's heart sank. Her granddaughter was the only family she had left. But how could she abandon her little companion? She couldn't. Instead, she hid the rat during the day and assured her daughter-in-law that he was gone. Her plan worked. That summer, her granddaughter arrived, and to Mrs. Marie's surprise, the little girl adored the rat. The two became inseparable, playing together every day. Mrs. Marie even felt a tiny pang of jealousy. She was no longer his favorite. Still, she found comfort in knowing that, for once, someone else accepted her little friend instead of calling her crazy. It made her feel less alone. Then came the night that changed everything. The air was warm, and as usual, Mrs. Marie and her granddaughter went to bed early. The little girl slept peacefully on the sofa, while Mrs. Marie rested in her bedroom. The house was silent, except for the occasional rustling of leaves outside. Around 1 a.m., a sharp pain in her foot jolted Mrs. Marie awake. Something was biting her toes. She gasped and looked down. It was the rat. Annoyed, she swatted him away and tucked her feet under the covers. He had never done this before. What was wrong with him? Just as she was drifting back to sleep, He scurried up to her face and bit her nose. Startled, she sat up and turned on the light. The rat stood in front of her, eyes wide and alert, desperately trying to tell her something. Then she smelled it. A sharp, awful stench filled the air. Bitter, rotten, like spoiled eggs. Her heart pounded. Panic surged through her. She jumped out of bed and ran to her granddaughter. The smell was even stronger in the living room. She shook the little girl gently. "Wake up, sweetheart," she whispered, but there was no response. Her skin felt cold, her breathing faint. Mrs. Marie's hands trembled as she pressed her fingers to the child's throat. A weak pulse. She didn't waste another second. Rushing outside, she screamed for help the village, quiet in the dead of night, stirred as doors creaked open. A young neighbor came running. Without hesitation, he scooped up the unconscious child and carried her into the fresh air. Within minutes, people filled the street, whispering and gasping in shock. The local doctor arrived and quickly tended to the girl. After moments that felt like an eternity, she stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Mrs. Marie let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Meanwhile, a few men, including retired engineers, rushed inside the house. They found the gas valve leaking and immediately shut it off. The situation was far worse than anyone had imagined. The entire house had been filling with toxic fumes. If they had slept just a little longer, neither Marie nor her granddaughter would have survived. As Mrs. Marie stood outside, catching her breath, she felt a small movement inside her pocket. She reached in and pulled out the little rat. He blinked up at her, his tiny nose twitching. Tears welled in her eyes. This tiny creature had saved them. The villagers, who once ridiculed her for keeping a rat, now saw him differently. When she explained how he had bitten her to wake her up, their expressions softened. Some even murmured apologies. The next day, her daughter-in-law arrived, shaken by the news. With tears in her eyes, she knelt beside Mrs. Marie and whispered, "I was wrong." She looked at the rat and added, "Thank you for saving them." From that moment on, the rat was no longer just a pest, he was a hero. The villagers, once disgusted by him, now spoke of him with respect. His story spread, becoming a cherished tale passed down for generations. So that's all for today. Now it's your turn to share your thoughts about this story. What's the next story you'd like to know? Let us know in the comment section below. And be sure to subscribe so you won't miss any of these amazing videos on Wild Wonder.